Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming here today. This is our first lecture series event for the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning. And today, in collaboration with Archie's, we're bringing to you Dr. Deirdre Pfeiffer, and she's going to talk about garages and driveways and adaptable neighborhood infrastructure. So I wanted to go over some of the rules before we get started with the lecture. Okay, so we're gonna go from until 1:20, and we want to have at least 10 minutes left for Q&A at the end. And if you're participating on Zoom, please type your question in the chat box, and also please keep yourself muted. Okay. And at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Daniel Kuhlman, who is Assistant Professor of Real Estate Development and Planning, to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
I always forget what my little thumbnail on the website looks like. It's always a surprise to see it. I'm Dan Coleman. I'm Assistant Professor of Real Estate and Urban Planning here. I am super happy to introduce Deirdre Pfeiffer. Deirdre Pfeiffer is an Associate Professor of Planning in the School of Geographical Sciences at ASU. She's also, along with a team here at University of Arizona, the director and lead, or the lead and PI of the Arches grant, which is a 3-year grant through HUD, Arizona, to found the Arizona Research Center for Housing Equity and Sustainability. Deirdre's work looks at health and housing and explores whether single-family home garages and driveways form an adaptive neighborhood infrastructure that has the potential to offer broad public benefits by studying how residents use these spaces for purposes other than parked cars, and the potential future for addressing pressing community issues like housing affordability, social isolation, and exposure to extreme heat will be the presentation she's obviously giving today. Deirdre wears so many hats, it is sometimes anxiety-provoking for me, but she's also a policy fellow currently with the city of Phoenix in the mayor's office. So I could go on, but I'll leave it there and join me in welcoming Deirdre.
Yeah. I think we can get that.
Oh yeah, I can do that.
So let's show some quotes in the slides. So you got to see those quotes. Thank you.
And then is it a different slide deck or?
Yeah, or we can just,
okay.
That's perfect. Yeah. So hi everyone, thanks so much for having me here today. So my goal in this talk is to give you a new language as well as a lens through which to view and think about single family home garages and driveways. So what we're going to be talking about today, I'll tell you a bit about my motivations for this research, which I would actually describe as one of my passion projects, for better or for worse. I'll talk you through some of the guiding ideas that structure how I think about garages and driveways and the role that they play in single-family home neighborhoods. I'll tell you a bit about my research approach, so how I went about collecting data and analyzing data to provide some insights about garage and driveway adaptations in Phoenix. And then we'll spend most of the time today talking through 4 main findings about garage and driveway adaptations in Phoenix. So I'll give you some insight into the extent to which people are engaging in these adaptations, what kind of adaptations they're undertaking, what drives these adaptations, as well as what some of the impacts of these adaptations are on households and communities. And then the goal is I'll end with some takeaways that will hopefully jump us off for that Q&A. So the motivations for this research. So this research is unique in that it's deeply rooted in my own lived experiences in the Phoenix region, as well as some unexpected insights that have come through my process of researching this topic. So this research started actually back in 2011, and it was inspired by the first place that I lived in Phoenix. And this is the home that is on the left on your screen. And I moved in the summer 2011, and this photo was taken just before I moved in. And to make a long story short, I did not get to know a single neighbor during 3 years living in this home. And those of you who know me know that this is a little off character because I'm a very social and extroverted person. And so at first, I was just thinking back on this and wondering, why was this the case? And I was like, oh, maybe it was because, I didn't have kids at the time. I've never had a dog. So children and dogs are what sociologists would call social lubricants. So they're things about us that bring us out into our environments, that give others an opportunity to engage with us. But then I was starting to think more about the homes in this community and the way that they're designed. And what's really notable about them is that they have this kind of garage scape that's attached to
of a house.
So a lot of the homes in the community, I would call them garage homes, or another word for them is snout homes. So homes where the garage and driveway take up much of the front part of the home. And what does this do to a home? What does this do to a block? Well, it makes the front yards of the block not social spaces where you have an opportunity to engage with neighbors, or spaces where you can engage with your natural world through plants and animals, but they turn them into functional spaces for cars. And I was starting to notice how people, were going in and out of their homes, and many people were treating their garages and driveways like their front walkways and front doors. So people would drive up the driveway when they got home, go into the garage, close the garage door behind them, and then repeat that process in reverse on the way out. And I was studying at this time the neighborhood factors that contribute to individual happiness. So how the neighborhood features relate to how happy we feel in our lives. And I was learning a lot about the role of social connectedness and how some of the features of neighborhoods, like their walkability or their amenities, really impact happiness, because they open up social spaces or opportunities for social engagement. So in thinking about this, I started to develop a hunch about these front-facing garages and driveways. Simply that they contribute to neighborhood social disconnectedness and individual unhappiness. And I guess I was feeling a little bit of that myself too, right? So I wanted to kind of find some broader reasons for this. And because I'm a researcher, what did I do? Well, I brought some data to this back in 2018. So I used an amazing data source from the Phoenix region that I'd highly recommend for folks who want to do some research up there, called the Phoenix Area Social Survey, which is a longitudinal survey that captures information on people's lives and well-being in 12 diverse neighborhoods within the Phoenix region, including how happy people feel and people's perceptions of the social life in their neighborhood, and a whole host of other characteristics that are linked to that outcome of happiness. And what I did was I brought a new variable into this database, and that variable I called the garage home intensity index. So it was to capture the garage homeness of people's neighborhoods for the people in this sample. And you can kind of see how I did this research. On the left, I used Google Street View, and I took a 1 in 5 sample of homes in these 12 neighborhoods. And I recorded a couple characteristics, which I brought together to form this index. So the proportion of the front of the home that was taken up by the garage, or the lot that was taken up by the garage and driveway, and then whether there were other features that made the garage and driveway have more primacy in the front of the lot. So whether there was a lack of a visible front door or a porch or front-facing windows. And then you can kind of see the outcomes of this index in the photo on the right. So it's a collage of example homes from each of these 12 neighborhoods. And those that are outlined in red were those that were the high garage home intensity neighborhoods. Those in green were kind of the lower ones. And in the middle, we have everything in between. And then what I did was I used statistical modeling to see whether there was any relationship between living in a high garage home intensity neighborhood and how happy a person felt. And I had very confusing findings. Basically, I found that for everybody, living in a high garage home intensity neighborhood was slightly associated with reporting lower happiness, but the effect wasn't super strong. Like, that was a little bit of a letdown. But then what I did was I started to dig into this data a little more. And I found that actually the impact of living in a high garage home intensity neighborhood on happiness was dependent on how long a person had spent living in the Phoenix region. And actually, if you're someone who's just moved into the Phoenix region, living in a high garage home intensity neighborhood means that you're a lot less likely to report being highly happy than someone who isn't living in this community that shares many of your other characteristics. But what happens is, as you spend more and more of your life living in the Phoenix region, and you can see this in this kind of upward slope happening on this chart, your odds of experiencing high happiness actually start going up if you live in a high garage home intensity neighborhood. such that this feature actually has a happiness promoting effect at the end of the day for those who've lived most of their life in the Phoenix region. And this just totally had me confused. I wasn't sure what to do with this. Is this about people just kind of giving up and accepting their car-oriented built environments and just, you know, kind of like becoming part of the herd with that? Or is something else happening here? And I started to get a hint of maybe something else going on, and looking closer at some of the images I was seeing through Google Street View. And so this image changed everything for me. So this is an example of a garage home, right? But what's notable about the garage home is the car. Where is the car located? It's not located really close to the garage or driveway at all, but it's to the side of the driveway. And what you see is a lot of other things happening in that garage. And then at the end of the driveway, you see some kids, like there's something dynamically going on with the space that actually has nothing to do with cars. And I started to look around in early 2020, you know, in the communities that I was engaged with, and I saw things like this. This was a home, you can see that someone has carved out a room in the garage. I later learned it was a man cave, and the husband was basically trying to escape the wife and kids, right? Scenes like this, piles of junk in the garage. On the bottom, it's a little blurry. I took this picture at night, but it's actually people working out in a garage. So garage turned kind of personal training zone. And then when I was doing these kinds of observations and starting to get a little more systematic with them, what happened? The COVID pandemic happened. And so this was March 2020. And all of a sudden, I started seeing this explosion in ways people were using not just garages and driveways, but also their sidewalks and streets, ways I had never seen them before. And so what I decided to do is I put this garage project on hold, and I teamed up with my colleague, Megan Allen, ASU, as well as my student Rabab Sadawi, and we did field work in 3 diverse City of Phoenix neighborhoods over the entire year of the pandemic, from March 2020 all the way to May 2021. And we simply recorded how people were using their driveways, sidewalks, and streets. And we found that people were using these spaces in novel ways in kind of two main purposes. So the first was to cope with the effects of the pandemic, to work through their emotions of the pandemic through like chalk messages and drawing, to also adapt activities that would typically occur kind of outside the home, but in spaces that were now closed to the space of the driveway, sidewalk, and street. And so you can see on the image of the left, you have a birthday celebration, right? That's happening on through the garage and the driveway. On the right, you have a space for children's play through this maze that invites other children to come in and play. So turning it into a little kind of mini park. We also found that people were trying to connect with each other through their driveways, sidewalks, and streets, through these public-facing messages like stay well, but also by having conversations with each other on driveways, sidewalks, and streets. And so on the right, this, if you're looking close, you can see a conversation. We miss you. We love your family. We hope to see you again. And so I had kind of an aha moment after this. And that's that, you know what, garages and driveways are not necessarily some kind of just functional space for cars, but they're also this adaptable space. And so I revised my hunch to the following, that front-facing garages and driveways form an adaptable neighborhood infrastructure that can help households and communities thrive. And so that gets us to the point of the current research project, which I'm going to present on today. So I basically went back to that 1 in 5 sample of homes in those past neighborhoods. And instead of recording the garage home intensity of that neighborhood, I went back and recorded how people were adapting garages and driveways in that sample. And then I also received some funding from the amazing group at ASU called the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience to go out and talk to people, to talk to neighborhood leaders, planners, developers, and others who are stakeholders in garages and driveways to get a sense of the why and so what behind all this.
Can you click OK at the top?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So before we get into that research, I just wanted to introduce you to 4 guiding ideas that shape how I think about garages and driveways and the roles that they might play in our neighborhoods. So the first guiding idea is around the idea of neighborhoods as systems, so neighborhood systems. So neighborhoods, yes, they are places where we live, where we raise our family, where we reproduce our cultures. But neighborhoods are also social systems. They're places where relationships form, communities form. They're units of social segregation more broadly within society across income or race, ethnicity. Neighborhoods are also economic systems. So many Americans, property owners, get most of their wealth from owning a home. But what happens to your home also affects your neighbors' homes. And then neighbors come together to put together regulations and other measures to help protect their wealth within neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are also vulnerable to economic disruptions. And so wealth is kind of rising and falling and unequally distributed across these units of neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are also places that deeply affect our health and have systems of kind of exposure to pollution and toxins and systems of access to resources and opportunities and amenities like trees that can help protect our health. And so you can think of these neighborhoods as a part of these layered kind of systems within our society. Another conversation that my research engages with is related to suburban retrofitting and repair. So this conversation comes from the place of basically acknowledging that the communities that we built during the post-war period dramatically privileged cars over people in that community design. And as a result, many of the communities we built, from that period, and I would say into the present, are actually inhumane spaces where people struggle to thrive. They're spaces that lack walkability, that have features that are bad for our health, where it's hard to socially connect. But what I love about this conversation is it comes from a place of hope. And this conversation is how we can make changes to our car-oriented neighborhood-built environments in small ways as well as big ways to make them more humane spaces. And so an example might be if you have a curvilinear street pattern, that might be good for cars, but not for walking. What you can do is build some pathways to kind of help bridge some of those curvilinear streets to enable more walkability in the neighborhood. Another conversation that my research is informed by is one on these urbanisms. And I group them all together because I think they're fairly related, but informal, everyday, and Latino urbanisms. And so this conversation is about the ways that people are continually adapting their built environment in small and big, informal to more formal ways in order to thrive in communities that they were given that may have values that kind of don't align with their own values or ways that they want to live their lives. And I think, like an example might be some teenage boys who love basketball, want to play basketball, but they live in a community where there's no basketball, hoops nearby, the parks aren't safe. What do they do? They take their cul-de-sac and they put up 2 basketball hoops on the cul-de-sac. They chalk out some of the lines and voila, right? They have a basketball court on their cul-de-sac. And did any city approve this? No, but they're doing that on their own proactively to thrive. And then the final literature, I just call it broadly housing adaptations, but it's about how the homes that we live in are designed using a certain set of values, but those homes are continually changing over time as people's values change, as social and economic dynamics more broadly within society change. And so just thinking of homes as dynamic spaces, not as stagnant spaces. And this is also literature where you can find some amazing deep dives into cultural histories of garages. So the role of garages and, as settings for tech startups or garage bands, right? And as well as some of those deep dives into driveways. And then I would say the final conversation that's a part of that, and it's very current, but relates to a particular kind of adaptation. So adapting garages for housing, for accessory dwelling units. So what are the opportunities here, barriers? How can we overcome them to kind of build out this strategy of accessory dwelling units through garages? So my research contributes to all of these conversations by drawing attention to what I think is an underexplored space. So the single family home garage and driveway and how they work together to be a part of these systems and how they can be a part of repairing our suburbs and how these kinds of urbanisms are taking place all the time in these spaces. So my questions are the following. How often do residents use single-family home garages and driveways for purposes other than to park cars? What kind of uses are present? What might drive residents to use garages and driveways in these ways? And how might these uses affect residents and neighborhoods? All right, so let's go ahead and look into how I did this research. So this research is situated in the Phoenix region, which is convenient, not just because I live there, I'm also choosing to focus on this research because I think Phoenix is an amazing laboratory for what people do when they're given one of the most car-oriented built environments on the planet. And don't quote me on that, but that's a little hunch I have we could explore later. So I'm using a qualitative mixed method approach in this research. So what this means, so the qualitative, my data or information comes in the form of photographs and spoken word and text, not numbers. And the mixed methods, what that means is I'm using different kinds of qualitative data to answer different dimensions of my research questions. So I'm using photographs to answer questions related to the what extent and the what of what is happening, the where. And then I'm using that text, which comes from interviews, to answer questions about the why and the so what of these adaptations. So in terms of the photographic data, I'm drawing on photographs of garage and driveway adaptations in 13 neighborhoods in the Phoenix region. And overall, I've collected photographs for 6,125 adaptations in the region. This map shows the Phoenix region, and in yellow are where those neighborhoods are located. The ones that are blocky yellow come from that Phoenix area social survey. And then the star neighborhood is one of the neighborhoods that we did fieldwork in during the COVID pandemic. This table just shows you how these neighborhoods vary based on their housing market and sociodemographic characteristics. So you see that fieldwork neighborhood in green at the top, the survey neighborhoods in that big block of blue, and then the county as a whole at the bottom as a reference. And you see how these neighborhoods compare, on the columns for percent of homes that are single family detached, percent of homes that are owner occupied, the age of housing, the income of people, the share of people of color. And I don't want you looking too closely at all the numbers, but just pay attention to how there's a big range of numbers here. So there's a lot of diversity in this sample of neighborhoods. So I obtained the photographs in two ways. One was through Google Street View and the other was through fieldwork, on the ground fieldwork. So in Google Street View, again, I was using that 1 in 5 sample of homes from the Garage Home Intensity Index, but I went back to that sample and then recorded whether there was any use of a garage and driveway other than parking cars. And then what I did was I did a 360-degree view around the home and also captured any adaptations that I could visibly see within that circumference. And so this is just an example. I'm doing that 360-degree view and I see a garage door open. It looks like something's going on. So I zoom in. What do I see? I see security lights on the garage. I see bicycles and other goods stored in the garage. And I see people on the driveway. In the fieldwork neighborhood, so again, this was done between 2020 and 2021. And data was collected in 3 phases, so I was careful to remove duplicate observations. But what I did was basically the same thing. The difference, though, I did 100% sample of homes in the fieldwork neighborhood. And I walked around and I recorded adaptations. So on the right hand photograph, I'm seeing there's kind of some security lights, maybe a camera on the garage. I also see an RV parked in the driveway. On the left, I see that Green Bay Packers flag on the garage. And then I did this fieldwork actually with my daughter, who's here in the center part of the screen, because this was COVID when all the schools were closed. So in terms of the interviews, so I did these with my student, Rabab Sadawi at ASU. And what we did was we collected the names of 100 people that were in kind of 2 categories that we thought were important for understanding the why and the so what. And these were neighborhood leaders, as well as people who had some kind of professional engagement with garages and driveways. So developers, planners, people who were involved in the housing space, architects. And of that 100 or so group, we ended up interviewing 26 people. And you can see the roles that these people played in the column on the left. A little less than half were neighborhood leaders. The topical areas of expertise that they reported in the center. We had more people with expertise in historic preservation than we were expecting. And then the geographic expertise that people represented on the right. And the big takeaway here is that geographically, this research much more represents the experiences in the center part and the eastern part of the Phoenix region, and not so much the western part known as the West Valley. What's important to know is the West Valley is more heavily Hispanic and Latino. And so this research does not do a great job, I think, of capturing the why and the so what from those communities. And then in terms of analysis, what I did was I brought together this data, I organized it into themes or categories that were drawn both from some of those guiding ideas that undergirded my conceptual framework, as well as kind of what I was discovering as I spent all this time looking through this data. And through that, answered my research questions. All right, so let's get into some of the findings. So the extent, the typology, and drivers of adaptations. And so this part of the findings is going to cover answers to this first part of the hunch. Do garages and driveways form an adaptable neighborhood infrastructure? So if you look at all the homes that I sampled, and it's about 7,000, a little over 7,100 homes, close to 30% of them showed some evidence of adaptation for purposes other than parking a car. Something important to understand, though, is that there was wide variation in the proportion of sampled homes with adaptations across the 13 neighborhoods. So the proportion ranged from 14% of homes to 85% of homes. So I think there's a lot of potential to really dig into this geographic variation in the future. So what I'm going to do is to talk you through the 7 kinds of adaptation that I discovered. So this is the typology, in order of those that were most common in the data to least common. And again, the data are these 6,125 adaptations. So the most common was expression, which involved uses of garages or driveways for textual, imagistic, or auditory expression. And examples are writing messages and putting them on garages, putting up flags on garages for political partisanship for sports teams, turning garages into art galleries, putting up decals or decorations for holidays like Christmas, or writing on driveways like we saw during the COVID pandemic. This kind of adaptation was mostly centered in garages, and there were a couple drivers, though the participants didn't bring up this form of adaptation as much as some of the others. As a sustainability researcher said, I participate in music jams in people's garages because there's not enough room in the house. So the small size of homes kind of bringing activities out into the garage and driveway is one of those reasons. And then COVID was, people talked about as being an inflection point in terms of how people use garages and driveways for these expressive purposes. And you see this in this quote from the social service provider who said, I spent a lot of time walking around my neighborhood. I saw a lot of hope expressed by people. It was through not just children, but parents making messages on their driveways. It was just that sense of I'm still part of the world, even though we're all kind of right now feeling the need to retreat from the world. The second most common kind of adaptation I call consumption and production. And this kind of adaptation involved anything pertaining to goods or pertaining to services. And I would say the most common would be just storing goods in your garage, which you can see in the photo on the upper right. But then also, other forms include making goods, providing services, maintaining goods like cars, or exchanging goods. And I think you can see this in the kind of driveway sale on the very bottom, or just people setting up stuff for free. Also, sometimes these goods just pertain to the household. Other times people were using garages and driveways to store goods that were associated with small businesses, it looked like the shaved ice trailer, or the kind of barrels and chairs stored in the garage in the center. What's notable is this kind of adaptation really occurred on both the garage and the driveway. So the small size of housing, and particularly the lack of storage space within housing, was a big driver, as you might expect. As a planning staff said, the garage is basically the basement. But people also talked about the kind of American tradition or culture of consumerism and tendencies people have to hoard things in America. But then other people were talking about how this is really prompted by changes that are happening in the household. So people are having children, which come with all these goods that you have to kind of find space for. They are also having their adult children move back into the home, which requires storing, a whole person's life basically within the home. So as a sustainability researcher said, as soon as you have kids, you have like unbelievable gobs of stuff. And a homeowners association community manager noted that the storage is the kind of stuff that's associated with a person moving their entire life back into a dwelling. Desires for cost savings and kind of co-locating your home and business was also a driver, and in particular something that an architect attributed to the more Hispanic communities. So in Latin American countries, it's very common to live as your house as a part of your business. And Hispanic people think, oh, why go and rent a place when I have space right here in the driveway to use as a business? And then also e-commerce and the rise of this has kind of opened up new ways that people can engage in the economy, including looping their garages and driveways in as storage spaces for goods that they might want to sell on Amazon, as we see in this quote from this homeowners association leader. So surveillance was another very common adaptation. This involved installing equipment or signage conveying eyes on the street, such as security messages or motion sensor lights or cameras that were facing the driveway or the broader block. This mostly occurred on garages, and not a single participant brought up this kind of adaptation. The last common adaptation was recreation, which involves physical activity, leisure, or play. This kind of adaptation really was centered on driveways. It often involved children, and probably the most common would be just the basketball hoops you see set up on driveways. But you also see children using driveways to ride their bikes, to scooter. You also see adults using garages as spaces to work out, as gyms. And the drivers here, safety was a huge one. So in these car-oriented built environments, parents trying to keep their kids safe, really want their kids playing on the driveway and not in the street. And you see this in this quote from a developer: it's just too hard to keep moving everything around every time a car comes down the road for these kids. And then COVID was also an inflection point for these garage gyms. So a housing advocate told us about how she'd gone to a boot camp for the last 3.5 years that's just for women. She said, it's in my trainer's garage. It's set up as a gym, and she set it up like that during COVID when all the gyms were closed, and has a neighbor who does the same thing. And we heard this actually a couple times in our data. Okay, now we're getting into some of the less common kinds of adaptations. And the first one would be uses for housing. And the literature, the existing conversation is really about uses of garages for, secondary dwelling units, or creating kind of bedrooms out of garages. And we certainly saw that in our data. So you can see that in the photographs where people are taking off the garage door and putting on other kinds of doors. We also, have this selected official developer shared, how their parents converted their garage into a room. There was 6 of us in a 3-bedroom, and we built a 4th bedroom in that driveway. We just needed flexibility for additional space, and doing it in a way that didn't require any new roof structures, which helped lower the cost of that. But something important to know is that we saw uses of garages and driveways for housing, but in lots of other ways that actually extended the appliances or activities that would occur in particular rooms of the house onto the garage or driveway, or brought in new uses that households maybe wanted in the design of their home but were not there. And so putting a refrigerator in your garage was a really common one. As this housing advocate said, it's kind of an extension of your kitchen. And then a planning consultant noted how a lot of people actually turn garages and driveways into porches. They put chairs in there, or they turn them into living rooms. So you can have this kind of outside communal space where you're able to interact with your neighbors. And then the final thing is we really saw driveways being used for housing too. I think in terms of RVs. So I think a lot of times we think that they're being stored on driveways, they're being used for leisure. People are avoiding paying the cost of storage facilities. But also we saw people putting RVs on driveways and putting hookups to the house and using them as this kind of secondary dwelling unit. Okay, a couple other adaptations. So nature restoration. So this involved bringing plants or animals to the garage or driveway. Most often this was on driveways, and you can see some examples like grass strips put into driveways, or planters on driveways, or making a driveway into a habitat for a domesticated dog. Or maybe you're putting things to attract wild animals onto the driveway, like a seed block or bird baths. For garages, this was usually vines growing up the garage, allowing plants to take over the garage, or an animal being present in the garage, as you see in the pigeon in the center. And our participants did not bring up this use as much, but this housing advocate, attributes it a little bit to pet ownership and how people will kind of use the garage and driveway as an extension of their front yard for pets. And then the final adaptation involves social engagement, which I call anything with 2 or more people. So this can occur independent of any other adaptation or together with other adaptations, most commonly consumption and production, recreation, housing. This mostly occurred on driveways, and interestingly, Halloween was actually cited as a big driver. So something to pay attention to next week. So several people brought up about how people will set up tables at the end of their driveways on Halloween, and it's a place where neighbors come together and watch the kids trick-or-treating. And I put my own kids from 2019, and you can see the driveway in the back and the glass of wine on the table, which makes it this social space. And so people also talked about how these other kinds of adaptations, using the garage or driveway to repair something, provides this opportunity for friction with neighbors. So we see this in this quote from this historic preservation advocate. It's someone can strike up a conversation with the neighbor when they're working on something outside. And the same thing with putting chairs out, turning garages or driveways into porches. People were talking about how sometimes people will proactively do that just to open up the possibility for engagement. Okay, so just the second part of this hunch. So what are some of the insights into how these adaptations might help households and communities thrive? So I'll just talk first about a few of the ways that I think these adaptations provide possibilities for enhanced well-being. I think the strongest evidence comes from what we just saw, the extent to which garages and driveways can bring about social engagement. And if that's true, they might help to facilitate social connections among neighbors. And why does this matter? And I would point you to the 2023 study that came out from the US Surgeon General about the epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States. And it traces this big uptick in this trend and connects loneliness to all these negative health impacts. And to the extent that these adaptations are bringing people together, maybe they're a piece of the larger puzzle in terms of solving this issue. The other thing that social connectedness does is it enables people to draw on relationships when social disruption happens, when disaster strikes, and may be important in building community resilience. This is my favorite photo from our COVID research. What it says is, "Be strong, Linda." And I think behind this photo, it's implying that there's a relationship here and a willingness to help that comes with that relationship, which is critical to this characteristic we call social capital, which communities is essential for communities drawing on for their resilience in the time of crisis. There's a little bit of evidence related to possibilities for enhanced physical activity through recreation, as well as in exchanging goods and services on driveways and garages through these kind of sales or markets, or in adapting garages into housing. Households might have income generation or cost savings, which could help to build their wealth. But I think more research is needed to understand that. And then, of course, and I like this quote from a developer who says, adapting a garage into a home is a cheap way to add space because you've already got those 3 walls and a roof, right? So there's a lot of cost savings that's attached to that. So there's possibilities for diminished well-being. I would say a big one, the biggest one we heard in our research, was that adaptations could appear chaotic and disrupt the community aesthetic and character. And this quote is an important one. This comes from a historic preservation advocate who says, "You want to put something on the driveway that's hideous? The neighbors are just going to say, 'What the heck are you doing? You're not just your house, you're your neighborhood. Do we care about our neighbors anymore?'" And I like this quote because it really differentiates kind of the implications of adaptations involving garages versus driveways. Driveways are more visible. There's more public ownership over driveways than over garages. Of course, cars and what happens to cars was a big one. People worried about obstructions of the sidewalk if cars are displaced out of garages. And then also obstructions on the street and safety issues coming up on the street if cars are put onto the block. And then another one, of course, which we don't have time to get into, are just homeowners association and local planning regulations. And acknowledging that a lot of these adaptations are actually openly flaunting especially the HOA regulations, where a lot of Phoenix residents live. And so if you're flaunting the regulations, there could be sanctions. And then finally, and this is related, but if you're doing things in an unpermitted way, there are two results that could happen that could diminish well-being. You could be building unsafe spaces that could expose residents to fire hazards. You could also expose your block to fire hazards and other health issues. But then I think this is important. A developer brought up that if you're building something unpermitted, it doesn't become part of your home equity because it's not a part of that appraisal. And so I think the takeaway here is that there's really a need for more research and community engagement to understand the possibilities and trade-offs of adaptations and their relation to community issues. And so what I'll say is that we are actually filling that gap right now through the Arches Center. So we're doing this research. We're bringing in a lot more perspectives into the data collection. We're also taking a close look at regulations and talking to people about how they feel garage and driveway adaptations relate to issues that they see in their communities now, but also how they could be used potentially to solve these community issues in the future. So I can talk more about that if folks are interested later. But just lastly, what are the takeaways that I hope we'll have a little bit of discussion around? I mean, going back to that original hunch, I hope I've at least shown you today that garages and driveways are widely adapted for uses other than parking cars. And this is my favorite slide, so you'll see why in a minute. Will you marry me? And that these uses may enhance the well-being of households and communities, but they might also create community issues that will need to be carefully managed. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we'll start with online questions first. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you want to open the chat there.
Sure. Okay. Anywhere I should start?
Whatever you want. Yeah.
Okay. So here's one from Roger. So one thought, there's a time component too. Absolutely, Roger. Some uses of driveways and garages are short-term, with lots of activity, human interaction, or long-term. How did you account for this in your research? Great presentation. Thank you, Roger. This was one of the many things I did not have time to talk about today, but is absolutely central here. There's seasonality to these adaptations. There's temporality. I gave you a hint of that with the COVID period, right? Like we see, you know, how people use these spaces change a lot when there's a huge social disruption happening, right? I'll say going back to these same communities where we did field work, you don't see all those, you know, garage and driveway messages like you did during the COVID. That has changed. In terms of seasonality, our participants really brought this up in terms of actually the social engagement adaptation. So people come out onto their driveways and kids are actually recreating on them when the weather's temperate, and they're not when it's not. I mean, this is kind of something we all understand as residents of the desert, right? But I think there's a lot more to explore about that, yeah, I'd be happy to talk with you about it later. And I think this also pertains to so in research, we think about generalizability, how what we're learning about in a particular context might relate to other contexts. And think about, I mean, Dan, you spent time in Vermont, you know, and how adaptations might be different there because of many aspects, but including the kind of seasonality aspect.
Do you mind stop sharing so we can actually see your face online?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. More.
Yeah, we'll take a few more online.
Okay, so some cities, so KP says, yeah, some cities don't allow living spaces in garages without a variance. I would say very, very few allow for this, although the law is changing, right, with our recent state directives. So what I would also say, KP, is actually, so we've done some research on the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, so the homeowners association regulations, which half of Phoenix residents are estimated to live in neighborhoods with these restrictions. And I would say 80 to 90% of them, and my student Rabab Sadawi was the one really taking a look at them, heavily restrict uses of garages and driveways for any purpose other than parking cars. And many of them also restrict use of driveways for parking overnight. So this is what we're dealing with here. Yeah. Okay, and then Serena, hi Serena, thanks for being here. Serena said, I'd be interested to hear if you had researched or thought about how carports might differ from garages. Excellent, because especially in a lot of our historic neighborhoods, it's carport, not garage. So in this research, carports are treated as driveways. So if something was hanging over the carport, I kind of grouped it into the driveway space. But in this next phase of research through Arches, we're differentiating garages, carports, and driveways. So I hope to be able to speak to more of that too, Serena. But what I would say is my hunch is that carports are going to follow kind of more the track of driveways because you have that same kind of visibility that driveways have. A garage is very different because you have that option to close the garage door and block from public view what's happening. So I think we would expect the kinds of adaptations are going to kind of follow those different allowances of those space.
We'll take maybe one more.
Okay, let's see. All right, Mari, okay. Oh, I think this is Mark. Hi, Mark. Mark is one of our Arches researchers. As a musician in this area, a NB National Play Music on Your Porch Day, which seems porchous to Phoenix musicians. Do you think there's potential for something comparable for garages? Absolutely, Mark. I've seen it in my neighborhood. I didn't take a picture because IRB had not approved at this point, but there was a drum circle that a neighbor of mine was having, I would say in between their garage and driveway. So I'll keep an eye out for that, but absolutely. And I think Mark's bringing up, what are the ways that we could kind of think about these spaces not as like one-offs with households or kind of blocks, kind of maybe, and adaptations are informed by what your neighbor's doing, but think of this in more of a collective way to achieve some kind of collective benefit from these spaces. And so, yeah, I mean, celebrate music, provide opportunities to engage in music. It's just like parking day provides some kind of collective conversation around parking spaces and what their alternative uses are. Let's do that for garages. And I think Mark would be a good collaborator maybe for that.
Good, yeah. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience here.
Sure, thank you. That's great. Coming up there. Two quick ones. What was that Phoenix area social survey you were talking about?
Yeah.
Is that public?
Absolutely.
Just Google that, I'll find it.
Yeah, and so what you'll do is to get, so it's a longitudinal survey. How amazing is that? I want to say there have been 4 phases. I've been a part of the data collection for 2. And the most recent, I think, was like 22, I think was the most recent. And yeah, go on the website, ASU Phoenix Area Social Survey. You'll contact, a person and then go through the process of getting access to the data.
Cool.
It's a tremendous resource. It is radically underused.
Appreciate it. And then you said some of the neighborhoods had like 14% or 29% doing the adaptations and then some 85%.
Yes.
Do you think it's all the neighbors seeing each other do it, and then once they see it being done, they adopt it more?
Yeah, so another thing I really want to explore, I call contagion. So I have the property addresses for these adaptations, and I think we're going to find some clustering of particular kinds. To get at the why behind that, we have to talk to people. So I hope we'll get at some of that with this Arches data collection. But yeah, but I have lots to, as a geography person, I have lots to think about that side. Yeah.
Renee?
Thank you so much. I am really interested in this as a landscape architecture master student. And I'm glad you brought up parking day because we did a project and we proposed utilizing the space for planting. And I was wondering if you saw any of that in your work, or if there's similar ordinances that prevent people from kind of like repurposing their driveways into landscape.
Yeah, I think there's so much, I think there's a lot of potential, like on the surface level, I see that. But then, yeah, you drill into the regulatory side and you start to see those barriers. But we have to remember regulations are social constructions, right? If we could try and change some of these regulations. And my data, and so, yeah, I saw I think it was only like 3% of all those 6,000 adaptations related anyway to plants or animals. But yes, I did see examples. It was mainly people putting planters on driveways, and you would see, the car would be displaced, right, in some of these lots.
I can think of about 4 zoning violations that occur in this area. I just wonder what your thoughts are. Recreational vehicles being parked in the driveway, commercial vehicle being parked in the driveway, open storage in the driveway. Probably 3rd, 4th one, but those 3 to start with. Did you look at those? Did you see anything changing? My feeling is those things aren't going to change.
Yeah, so those were all actually quite common, I would say, like as a group in my data. So lots of that going on in the Phoenix region as well. And yes, we also, homeowners associations, we're right now looking at the planning regulations, so we're still trying to understand that, but definitely the HOAs heavily restrict those kinds of activities. And I think there are changes going on because of the rise of e-commerce. And so, and again, we got some of this insight from the neighborhood leaders who are starting to see kind of, I mean, they claim that there are these households that have kind of Amazon type of businesses or others that are linked to e-commerce, and they're using kind of garages and driveways as warehousing some of those goods. So I have not tested that change over time with the data, but I have a hunch that maybe we're seeing some change over time in that.
So I have a 1950s house about 2 miles from here, and one of the bedrooms probably at some point was garage. But it appears that sort of design, kind of a modular design, that it was meant to be adapted. And I'm curious if you, like, obviously the design of houses that you're looking at that era, clearly it's a garage.
Right.
And a house. If you did see any examples of designs that were more adaptable or maybe intentionally adaptable, where you see a future where perhaps suburban home designs could incorporate more.
Yeah, I think there's.
Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, so the question was, yeah, Arlie like lives in an older home and it has a hunch that, you know, his garage was kind of designed to actually accommodate a bedroom to be, so we call this more incremental housing design, like housing that's designed for future growth. It's not this idea that you have to be one and done, right? And it's kind of like, you know, the tract home or whatever is like fully complete, right? And so, yeah, he was just asking if I've seen some evidence of that. And yeah, so again, really good question. I'm interested to like dig into that with the household interviews that we're in the process of. But I would say with the older homes in Phoenix too, I mean, you see like, especially even the carports, it's like there's this space that is kind of, you have some space on the lot to kind of work with at the front of the home. Whereas in the snout homes, I mean, it's just, they're taking up most of the lot, right? And there's very little to work with there. And I'm curious the kind of why that change, right? I mean, I think we have to think about developers here. You know, what kind of information were they drawing on and making these choices back in the 50s or 70s versus the 2000s? And what does it mean for, you know, how households are able to inhabit these spaces? Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, thank you for the talk.
I haven't seen.
And yeah, just from an architectural point of view, I was thinking like these homes that are these like a lot of the images that you were showing at the end are just like repetition, right? It's very clear repeated armature for like that social behavior, right?
Yeah.
Because if everyone has kind of the same starting point and like more easily imagine or something. So I was just curious if you differentiated your data between like these kind of planned communities, garages facing the street, I guess, obviously, and then and other neighborhoods that don't kind of have, and is it kind of, you know, is adaptation more possible strangely in planned communities?
Yeah, and so I haven't, so again, this is the geographic component, which I just so want to dig into, but Arches is keeping me so busy. But yeah, and so I think like the age of the community, which is linked to the kind of design of the homes, right? I think we're going to see differences in bundles of adaptations or the range of adaptations based on age. I mean, in some of the newer tract home communities, what's interesting is sometimes I'll even wonder, like, we'll see planters on the driveway and it's like the same planter on every home. And I guess maybe the developer kind of brought that in from the start, right? But I think the range is a lot more limited, just, I don't know, anecdotally from what I'm grasping right now, in those newer communities where you have more of the snout homes. We see a lot more range of adaptation, more intense kinds of adaptation, meaning ones that are more permanent, difficult to, you know, move away when you want to park the car. In some of those older communities, like carports, more ranch design rather than the kind of Spanish style mission design in the Phoenix region.
Yes, I liked the presentation and how you kind of broke about, how you started off in one place about garages and you kind of opened to the data that you received the results and kind of ended up in a different place. So I thought that was really interesting. I guess we talked about the zoning violations of current places and future measurables, but do you see any policy implications or design recommendations for kind of newer subdivisions being built in Phoenix that all still have the same template for what a garage should be, or?
Yeah, I think that, so, I mean, just thinking, I think it's always a good thing to think about homes and, you know, as having the possibility for more multifunctionality and flexibility of design. And I mean, a change that we've seen in the Phoenix region is around multi-generational home building, which kind of brings that in, right? Rather than requiring, you know, a property owner to build their own ADU, why don't you just integrate that into the home that you're offering? So I think there's a lot of possibility for that in the Phoenix region. I mean, I think the big takeaway is related to the social connectedness piece that comes out most strongly. And just when you're reviewing site plans, you know, plans for new subdivisions, like where is that social connectedness? You know, where is there the possibility for that? And I think it's an open question. You know, does the possibility for that come more from giving homeowners or households this unstructured space, right? Like the kind of black box or, you know, open, you know, canvas of the garage or driveway, or does it come from more kind of environmental determinism, like you're putting in like, you know, the kind of hangout spaces or whatever, community centers? I think that'd be a great research question. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I think we got to think about social connectedness. The US Surgeon General's report tells us we need to think about social connectedness more in planning and design.
Good, maybe we can take one more question from online.
Okay, so Romina says garages are changing too. I saw side entry garages, and for me, it is a big space that you have inside your lot where you can share with your neighbors and also with your family. And I think it should be proposed not just as a driveway, maybe should be a project as a front yard where you can sit. Yeah, right. Yeah. So yeah, a lot like the newer homes, you have the front facing garage and driveway, and then there's oftentimes a side garage. I didn't study them in the research. I just studied the front facing because it was what was more visible to me from the way that I collected the data. Okay. And then Jack asks, what are your thoughts regarding alley loaded garages? Have you researched any of these types of subdivisions and their potential benefits for neighborhood interaction? Yeah, I had a couple alley loaded garages in the data set. So Gilbert is covered in the Phoenix Area Social Survey, and there's at least one community that had alley loaded garages. And what's interesting was when the garage was open, it seemed like people were doing very similar things with their garages, maybe not turning them into porches so much, but they had them as gyms, they had them for storage. So I think there's some kind of commonality, but I think that's a good question. How might the kind of position of the garage affect how it's used? And I think, you know, an expectation is if it's not facing the street and the block, I mean, you know, with the alley loaded garages, all the kind of social attention is put at the front of the home where there's usually an open green and kind of walkways, right? These kind of more new urbanism design communities. You know, I think we're probably going to see less social activity connected to the garage and driveways, but good research question.
Well, good. I think we'll finish. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. So thank you. You'll be around for a few more minutes to answer any other questions that we can get to, but there's still a lot of food left, so please grab some food. And yeah, thank you. I will see you again in November for our second lecture.
Thank you.